Hello and welcome to another episode of the Privacy Pros video series. This is an initiative by the SCI Circle, where SCI stands for Privacy and Security Innovators Circle. As a part of this initiative, we published an eBook with articles written by leading privacy experts. We are also doing a series of short interviews with them about their articles. And I have one such expert with me today. His name is Greg Vaisberg. Currently, Greg leads the legal team responsible for all aspects of privacy and security at Nutanix Technologies. So welcome, Greg. It's a pleasure to have you here today. And for the benefit of our audience, can you please start by giving a quick introduction of yourself and your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So like you mentioned, I lead the legal team here at Nutanix. We're an enterprise infrastructure company, and my team is responsible for all of product privacy and security. Part of it, I've become very passionate about privacy and specifically the intersection of privacy and technology. Privacy, technology, and as I like to also say, operations, which is why I chose to share with our audience the topic of privacy framework and more information security framework that I believe really should inform the way we think about all data in the company, not necessarily just personal data, that I think will not only help us gain further customer trust, us as an industry, but also enable us to build strong operational ties that I think are really required now between the operations, engineering, compliance, and legal teams, and really at any company.
That makes sense. Thanks, Greg. So like you said, you've written an article that's titled Data Lifecycle, Good Governance is Good for Business. And in the article, like you said, you laid out a pretty typical life cycle for any information and 7 core aspects related to it. You've also provided a framework that organizations can use, for ROPA, that is record of processing activity, but just this framework is useful for so many other things as well. So yeah, can you tell me a little more about, why this is important and, why this topic specifically?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, for one, it's complicated. It's I talk a little bit in the article about, and I think when I was writing an article, I think I was having my annual checkups at the doctor, and I may have just recently gone to a lab, and I thought, well, that's interesting, right? A blood sample in a lab never gets lost practically. We don't always, misplace our keys or lose our mobile phones. We keep pretty good track of physical assets. I've been thinking a lot about the complexity of tracking data because data is really the lifeblood of our business today. And when I say that, I don't just mean personal data. It's very easy for us to think about the consumer data usage that we've been hearing a lot about in the press with social media and others and advertising. But truthfully, any company has data, and any company has data that they need to protect, whether it's personal or confidential information. And that could be starting from the very thing that makes your business, your employees. You hold personal data about them with respect to the intellectual property that they create for the company. That is also an asset that is confidential and should be protected. Information that your customers share with you, whether that is their account login information, workloads that they process with you, if you're a cloud provider that has information about their customers, or confidential information that they provide as part of the services you provide them and enable you to have access to their confidential information. And then lastly, any personal data that you receive as a result of supporting those customers or supporting your customers' customers or being a sub-processor. So it's a very rich life cycle and a rich data set. And I think that one of the reasons that I proposed this framework as a general data governance framework rather than a privacy governance framework is because it's truly applicable to all data. And it really highlights the difficulty of identifying what type of data it is, and then consequently how you're going to use it and how you're going to enable other users in the company to use it. But I think we are at a technologically pivotal point where we as an industry can actually tackle this. And I think that only happens through a close collaboration with others in an organization. This is an operational problem as much as it is a legal and compliance one. And if we approach it as such, then I think we emerge with stronger relationships because we're starting with the why and we're providing a clear guidance on the how to our business partners to actually execute the things that we need to provide that level of visibility.
Right. I completely agree with you when you said that, data that we tend to store, or organizations tend to store, it's so rich. There's so many facets to it. It's not always just about, personal information. There's just so much to it, and that's why it's complex. But you've laid out a framework in your article, and you mentioned several times that the framework is simple. But we all know that, the simple things are the ones that are hardest to implement, right? So what has your experience been like so far? What would you say are the top 3 or 4 challenges that organizations face when they even want to remotely implement anything of the sort?
A couple of things. I think one is making sure that you have a proper, whatever system you use, right? And there are myriads because the data sources are myriad, but whatever sources you use, you can always identify the point of origin, right? And that really requires you to understand your organization. Where is the data coming from? For customers, from partners, from leads, and other sources. What are the systems that are actually ingesting it, right? So this really, you mentioned in your introduction, ROPA, right? And fundamentally, a good ROPA is essentially this model, right? If we just look through a ROPA lens, most data should be trackable through that framework. And really, this framework just kind of double clicks on a few areas and kind of expands operationally on what may be required. So I think the challenging thing first is just mapping your assets. What are your ingestion points and where's the data coming from? And from there, you can start to actually parse, once you find where the data is coming into the company, what rights you're receiving to that data and what that data actually is. Because it's very important to essentially earmark each piece of data with the rights you have with respect to it and the kind of uses you can make of it. Because as we all know, whenever we receive data, we don't have unfettered rights to it. It's not something that we created. And therefore, it's either subject to a licensing agreement, to a non-disclosure agreement, or subject to privacy regulations and your data processing agreement with your customers, for example. It is subject to obligations to your partners. You may be a controller of that data, you may be a processor of that data, but there are strict obligations, and you have to know how you can use that data before you can make use of it and make sure you use it within those parameters. The other difficult part is the ease of replication of data within any organization today makes it difficult to know where it's going. And so mapping where the data resides, and that actually includes access, is also quite imperative and something that is absolutely aided by a good relationship with your IT team, your engineering team, to be able to map that data, and also technological solutions that we have today, such as LightBeam, that can help with discovering where your data actually is. And that foundational set of elements really then enables the next step, which is the most difficult, setting up the access, security controls, and the use restrictions. Because recall that each piece of data that we have can only be used for a specific purpose. And so in order to be able to technologically implement access controls, security restrictions, and analytics limitations, you must have earmarked the data with elements that identify what that data can be used for. And then you can pass those permissions and limitations onto individuals and systems who utilize or have access to that information. And and somewhat thereafter, because you have identified everything, you know what you're using it for, and you know where it came from, you're able to keep that data up to date to make sure you're making good decisions and you're not using stale data. And that's really at best, right? At worst, you're having data that is inaccurate and you are actually not compliant with your obligations to ensure that your processing activities are. Once kind of the often overlooked area is the term. When do we delete it, right? And how do we delete it? And given the wealth of data that companies are processing today, you really have to think about that up front. It's the last piece of the life cycle, but you must identify that with technological means, whether that is a piece of data that is regulatorily required to be kept for a period and deleted in accordance with regulations after a certain period, or whether it's data that you actually have under privacy regulations establish and maintain lawful basis of processing for, you must have a mechanism that actually implements this. And each one of these represents a challenge, but I would say that they're surmountable today with appropriate tooling, but really most importantly, with appropriate operational rigor and really strong relationships across the organization. Anybody today in any organization can onboard new tools, can move data around, and if these controls are not implemented, it's simply not traceable. And that traceability gives a tremendous amount of power, not just for compliance, but also for strong organizational and business insight.
Right. So if I'm hearing you right, that there are obviously a lot of challenges along the way, but the most important thing here to overcome everything is, like you said right at the beginning, just to earmark all of your data, just have as much information as possible about where it's coming from, where it's going, what it's being used for, how long is it going to be around. The more information you have, the more easier it is to implement some of these things, right? So in your article, you've laid out a pretty detailed framework, but you've also provided pretty detailed recommendations, right, on what should happen around each aspect of data. So if you had to just very quickly summarize your learnings and give your colleagues any kind of advice, what would it be?
Partner with your security organization and your IT organization. And help them discover all of the assets you have. Do a proper data mapping exercise. And the data mapping exercise starts with understanding all of the assets you have that actually touch data and all of the use cases that you have. So you have the essential elements of your record of processing. If you approach it from a record of processing perspective, you won't go wrong. This framework overlays that and is helpful by providing additional questions. But if you start with where is my data, what data do I have, and what rights I have with it, and document that, you can then establish what you need for all of the subsequent steps. How do you secure that data? Who should have access to it? What are we going to use that data for? What can we allow that use of data for? And implement appropriate set of operational measures that are actually going to be technologically enforced.
So what I'm hearing is basically, like you said, look at this like a record of processing activity, look at all of your data, everything that you store from that lens. And more importantly, make this extremely collaborative. Like you said, partnering with the right teams within your organization, IT, engineering, especially, that is the key to a successful foundation for any of these processes.
Absolutely.
Okay.
This is absolutely an operations problem, and it really can bring your teams closer together for a much stronger partnership across all of the functions, whether it's marketing, HR, engineering, product development, and of course, legal and compliance, who often lead these functions, lead these activities. We can't do it alone. We absolutely need that partnership, both from a knowledge perspective as well as technological perspective.
That makes sense, Greg. Thank you so much. This was really insightful. And for our audiences, I just want to say that this was just a very small snippet of the article that Greg has written. I would highly recommend all of you to go ahead and read it. Like we've discussed even in the interview, it lays out like a very typical information or data lifecycle along with recommendations on what each organization is to do to keep in mind, or aspects that they need to keep in mind about every aspect of that information or data. And like Greg says, think of things from the perspective of how can I maintain a good record of all my processing activity, right? So yeah, good data governance indeed is good for business. So please make sure that you read this chapter in our latest ebook. The book also contains several other chapters by other leading privacy experts. So please go ahead. I would highly recommend you to read it. For more such content, follow the Privacy and Security Innovators Circle page on LinkedIn. And of course, if you're curious about what LightBeam does, please visit our website, which is LightBeam.ai. And stay tuned for more such interesting content. Thank you so much.